Thank you for watching, and now's the opportunity for you to put your questions in the chat if you want to. But firstly, I'd just like to say that people often feel very anxious about watching our film. I think that there's a fear that it's going to fill them with dread and negativity, but in making this film, we hope that it offers up something other than that. And by sharing our stories, we allow other people to understand what it's like from the inside out, to experience such an unthinkable thing as the death of your child. Now, it's very early days for Liam and Deirdre. It's only 4 years since their beautiful daughter Lisha died. And I'd like to ask you, how are you both doing now? Who'd like to answer that? There you go.
Okay. It's hard to answer that really, because I don't really know how we're doing, really. In general, I think we're doing okay. For myself, I think I've come a long way in the last 4 years. I never thought I'd be here now, and that's what's such a good thing. When I first saw your film, it was a year after Lisha had died, and I felt very much like the people who had been newly bereaved in the film, and I didn't think that I'd be able to come out from under that stone or that black cloud. And now I feel for the first time since Lisha died that I'm able to just poke my head out and enjoy the sunshine. So I feel that I'm doing okay, but it's up and down, and it's good some days and it's bad other days. But in general, I think I'm doing a lot better than I thought I would be doing.
I think, Deirdre, that offers so much hope to people, because I know that virtually every bereaved parent I've ever spoken to, and I've spoken to many, they think that they won't survive, and they think they can't find their way through it. I wonder, for you, Liam, as a dad, how does it feel now, 4 years on?
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine in those early days that there was a way out, having spoken to a lot of other bereaved parents, you know, we share experiences which are that you don't really, and it came out in your wonderful film as well, that you don't really ever go beyond the grief. You grow with the grief to some extent, and you learn to live with the loss of your child, and you learn to live with the grief. But of course, in the early days when Lisha died, a day didn't seem like a day, a second didn't seem like a second. Our whole beings were consumed with grief, and there was no distraction, there was no relief really. And I suppose you learn techniques, you learn either on purpose or it just happens naturally that you learn how to cope with that. And somehow you have to go along with it, and not control it, but be at one with it, and let it go with you, I suppose. And that journey is still ongoing. It's only been a few years, as you say, but it does seem like a very long time in some ways. But when I reflect back to the early times, the early days and weeks and months after Lisha died, it didn't seem possible that I would be at this point now. Does it feel easier? It feels different for sure. We still feel a huge sense of loss, but we're here and we're functioning and we're together, and we still give a lot and take a lot from the community around us.
You know what, I have to say that I find it a lot easier talking about Josh and talking about our grief with other bereaved parents like yourselves. I really do find it an awful lot easier to do it. And while you were saying there, for me, it was something about being able to share, speak openly, is what you were saying, Deirdre, about you kind of, once you come out of that cocoon of just wanting to bury yourself in and cut away from society, which is what I did. At that moment, when you're coming out and sharing it with other people, that seems to me a bit of a sort of like a Rubicon that you can get through, and then it starts to become a little easier because you've spoken openly about it. And for me, speaking openly about grief with other bereaved parents is so much easier than it is with people who aren't bereaved.
I suppose there's something about everyone intends to be able to help with these difficult conversations, but actually, you know, before you lose a child, you can't imagine how you're going to talk about it. I mean, I'm a therapist, so I suppose that I've been trained to deal with discomfort. However, when people say, I can't imagine how you feel, you kind of think, well, I'm kind of glad you can't imagine how I feel. But on the other hand, you want people to know how you feel, because grief can be lonely. And I know that in the first few years of my grief, and I know it's only 4 years for you guys, but I found it very difficult and very challenging and very isolating. Whereas now, I don't feel that anymore. I feel that Josh has taught me so much about what matters, what helps, what doesn't help. And it's a kind of ongoing, it's like a fast-track PhD. I wonder what you guys have learned. What helps?
Oh, goodness. Well, a couple of things there that you've mentioned. In the early days, I just had to get out and run. I just ran. And I would run every day until I couldn't run anymore. And Jane, you've mentioned in the film that you would run and then find a field to sit in. For me, I would run along the canal path and I would just bawl my eyes out as I was running and really let it out. And I, like you, I hope nobody's coming, because if they're coming, they're going to think something really bad has happened to me. And if they ask me, what will I say? And I thought, well, I'll just have to say what's wrong. Nobody ever came past it in those moments. But for me, that was a relief and a release at the same time, because I just didn't want to say to somebody, I'm feeling really bad because my daughter has died.
Yes.
That's it. If somebody comes across you like that, you've got to shut it down.
Well, yeah, I was well prepared to do that, and I could see them coming in the distance because it's a long and flat canal path, as you know. And so by the time I reached them, I had got hold of myself. But that was my release, so that's how I dealt with it. And the other thing I did was to use my hands to be crafty and to make things. So some of Lisha's t-shirts, which she had loads and loads of t-shirts, she loved her t-shirts, and I would cut up her t-shirts and just make cushion covers for family members, just something to do.
That's beautiful, isn't it?
So that was how I dealt with it in the early days, and I would just talk to Liam, and we'd sit there together and just talk about her and try to understand how we were feeling, but we couldn't really understand how we were feeling, and we would just say to each other, and Liam in particular would say to me, we're just sad that she's not here anymore. And there was no other making sense. You couldn't make sense of how you felt. I couldn't put it into words at all. Even now I struggle to put it into words.
So sometimes language is so inadequate, isn't it? And words are not enough. But something about being creative or active, which of course is what the Good Grief Project's based on, writing or being active, taking photographs. But I think that stuck feeling is so difficult in the early stages. And there's something about just finding a way through. I'm seeing some questions coming up here. So there's questions from actually Joe, Josh's brother, which is really nice. Hi Joe, it's great to have you on. And the question is, Joe says, what I've observed over the last 10 years, grieving with you both, and I think he means me and Jimmy, and seeing how you've expressed your grief so openly. And he says, like with other family in the film, you've exposed what many may feel is too sacred, too personal, too private to share with anyone. Has that been scary? Well, yes. It's always scary to share personal stories, and I think that every bereaved person I've ever spoken to has told me how scary it is. And what's interesting is in this time of COVID, it's even more interesting to look at the sort of metaphorical mask, isn't it? We put our masks on, and in a way, you said to me, you've been wearing a mask for years in many ways and getting on with your lives as best you could since Lisha died. But actually, there's this thing about sharing what's behind the mask. And so you'd go running and you'd be frightened that people might see what was on your face, what was really happening emotionally. And it takes guts. So yes, Joe, it's always scary. But you also ask, what have been the biggest challenges? And what has most positively impacted on your own grief? The biggest challenges, I think, has been about adapting to this new world. No parent should ever outlive their child, should they? And so when it happens, you're kind of left with a loss of trust in the world. And for me, I think the most difficult thing was finding trust again. To find some way of trusting in the world and gaining confidence, because I know that, I can honestly say that, and in answer to your question, Joe, when your child dies, you kind of lose your identity as a parent, as a mother. You think, could I have done something else?
I absolutely concur with that. Absolutely, the idea that you lose all confidence. For me, having a sense of not only have I lost, as Josh died, and that we've lost him to the world, I've also lost my role as a dad to him. And for me, and I don't know, that did really impact not just on my sense of identity of who I was, but how I could then operate in the world in relationship with other people. And that business, and it comes back to that business about that is the challenge of being able to be open with it and talk to other people about it. And once you've done that, then you can receive back, right, that you get more confidence, you grow again in relationship with other people. That's what I think.
It's quite interesting that you were saying earlier on, Jimmy, that you have found it easier to talk to other bereaved parents, and I'm just aware that there'll be lots of people who are listening to us who aren't necessarily in that situation. Many of whom I think would probably want to engage with bereaved parents like us, and maybe find some kind of difficulty there, just because it's innately difficult. It's awkward, isn't it, to have to approach them when you don't know what to say, really. Is it just the fact that bereaved parents maybe find that common denominator there, that you can put aside the niceties of having to talk about the death of a child, because we feel as though we've got something in common, and the Good Grief Project is about kind of closing that gap, isn't it? And about allowing bereaved parents to talk to other people and saying it's fine to talk about these things. Is that...
So what we can do, for instance, in the retreats, is that we form a bubble whereby it's very easy for people to talk to each other. And that bubble can be a kind of a practice area, in which you then take the lessons of how you then talk about your dead child, and you can go out to the rest of the world and be more open about it. I mean, I think a lot of it is my own personal stuff as well. All right, it's all because there are degrees of like guilt and shame that are mixed up with the fact that Josh has died. How responsible am I for not keeping him alive? And I know that's nuts, but there's a background stuff there, and it's very difficult to talk about that.
I've never come across a bereaved parent who doesn't talk about the guilt and the shame. Even though we know there's nothing we could have done to actually make it any different. But of course our role in life is to protect our children, to give them roots and then to let them fly, roots and wings. And of course, in a way, I can talk personally here and say that Josh's death caught me off guard, because in a way he was having the time of his life. He'd left home, he had the job of his dreams, he was happy, he was having such a good time. And then of course, bang, everything's changed, and you just think, wow, I didn't have a chance to say goodbye. And I can't help but be preoccupied with COVID right now, and the fact that an awful lot of people are grieving. In fact, nearly everyone's grieving for something right now. And there's so many people who didn't get to say goodbye. And our experience has taught me that ritual can really help. Even if you're not with someone when they die, there could be a big gap, maybe, between actually their death and whatever it is that you do to say goodbye. I wonder if that's something that you've had any thoughts about.
Well, I can see a question come up on the screen there from, if you had to offer one piece of advice to a newly bereaved parent, what would it be?
Well, I would say just accept how you feel right now, but know for sure that you will feel differently about it in the future. There is hope that you will move out of this black hole that you're in now, and that you will be able to move on in your way with your grief, and that it will be okay.
Accepting.
Yes, accept how you are now.
So the word there is hope, isn't it? Because without hope there's nothing. And I guess in answer to that question I would say, and it's Jill Mann who's asked that question, who's written the most amazing book which I can really recommend to people, but what I would say is that it's something about recognizing that everybody grieves differently, and that there's no right or wrong way to do it, and that if you can just make allowances for yourself and be kind to yourself, in a way that's the best I can offer. And I think as well, finding peer-to-peer support, being very careful who you talk to about it, because for some people it's too much, and that's okay. But in the early stages of grief, you might not know that. So peer-to-peer support, like the compassionate friends that helped us enormously in the early years, you know, contact people who've been through it. And that's how we came in touch with you two, isn't it? And we've talked immediately, like we've known each other for years, even though you were in an early stage of grief and you weren't really talking necessarily to anyone, but we immediately kind of connected.
I think there's something to be said. It's different for different people, isn't it? And different people will find different ways through their grief. But there's something to be said for finding something to focus on other than your grief, and it's going to be very different for whoever it is. But it might be work. It might be a new project. It might be music. It could be a creative process. And you talk about the use of creativity to sort of express or talk about grief. And finding something that is almost like a distraction. You have to address the grief, but also you need time to be away from it at times as well. And for different people, it'll be different things. But for me, certainly finding something to put my energy into has given me a break from the intensity of the emotion that you will be faced with all the time if you don't manage to do that.
Yes, and you don't know, do you, when you're in the early stages of grief, that the edges will get less jagged with the passing of time. You don't know that. The sharpness is excruciating. It's beyond agony, but actually it's 10 years this January for us, and the edges are a lot less sharp, and we miss Josh every day. We talk about him comfortably. We celebrate. At Christmas we raise a glass to him. In fact, we'll be raising a glass to more people than Josh this Christmas. But you know, it's about acknowledging that person and folding them into your life comfortably.
I remember when you were talking about distraction, I was always a little bit confused between distraction and denial, and diverting my real feelings away from the really painful stuff and trying to get out of them in some way. And I think that those two things can actually happen quite, in tandem in a way.
And you're protecting yourself as well.
Yeah.
If you can't cope with the intensity of that, then you cast it aside for a while until you can come back to it.
And I think that's why people talk about the waves.
Yes.
And there's an ups and there's downs. And sometimes when you're feeling fairly, you're riding high, and then there's sometimes when something's going to happen, and then the ground just falls away from you, and you just dump down again.
Some great questions coming up here. Can you say something about the other feelings that grief engenders in us? Anger, envy, bitterness. These can interfere with life going forward. How have you managed them? Well, I know I can say really badly in the first couple of years, but over to you. Who wants to take that one up?
Ooh, anger.
Yes?
Yeah, I was angry. Yeah, I could be really angry, and I didn't really know what was happening at that point either. I really didn't know, and it was being taken out on other people. For me, envy wasn't. It wasn't really. That wasn't part of it, really. I don't think so. What happened?
That's interesting you say envy wasn't part of it for you. I think I have in the past been envious of other families who haven't suffered grief, and they have children who are well and happy. And I wouldn't say it's made me angry, but I've been sort of wishing that was my life, and wishing that Lisha was back with us.
Yeah.
And that's a form of envy, I think.
Yeah.
And I think so.
More questions coming up here. To what extent have your other children been a focal point to help you get through your grief?
Oh, wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah.
Dee, you must have something to say.
Well,
there.
for us, Michael has definitely been a focal point. In fact, we had to apologise to him because the poor fella had all of our attention and all of our love and all of everything else as well. And if it hadn't been for Michael, I don't know where we'd be really. So I think it's really important to have other children to focus on. And he has been absolutely brilliant. He's been amazing in dealing with his grief and ours as well. So definitely having Michael has really helped me.
Yes, there was one of the families you worked with on the making the film, and I said during the film to Jane and Jimmy, I said the child at the time seemed to have been incredibly strong and almost held things together, you know. And I think children have a role to play there, unwittingly and unwantedly. But I'm sure that whilst parents are finding it very, very difficult, and so are the children, obviously, quite often they're there to pick up the pieces. And certainly there's been times when you've been in pieces and I've been in pieces, and we've been looking after each other, and Michael has just kind of propped the whole thing up, I think, and kind of got on with the job, and that's been superb.
It's really interesting. Right, and you said this, and I would say this: if you don't have any other surviving children, and we've talked about this a lot, and with the people we've made films with, what keeps you going? Well, you can't just roll over and die, can you? You know, in a way, you have to carry on. And so my heart is just, I'm so aware of all the people who don't have surviving children, because my surviving children are the centre of my universe. They give me hope. I feel ashamed for sharing my grief so openly, but actually, I did ask Rosa fairly recently, have we overshared? And she said it was a bit late to ask. So I think being brave enough to share with your children takes the most enormous courage, because you don't want them to see your pain. But if you don't let them see your pain, how can they show their pain? So that's one of the most important parts of helping other children. There's some questions here from Jess, and I think that's Jess, who was one of Josh's school pals, a great friend, and he says, second time I've seen the film, equally as impressive and challenging, but he says, you threw yourselves into lots of projects. This film was one of them. Out of all the things you did, what was the most helpful of all these projects?
Well, photography for me is an ongoing thing, and so, you know, it's another lifeblood for me. So I continually producing things photographic, but I wouldn't effectively call them projects as such. I mean, I think that making this film and its aftermath has been really one of the most helpful things. But on a basic human one-to-one basis, way of looking at things, I think it's the active grief program that we run, and it's being able to work intimately with other people on their own creative projects, which for me has been the most helpful, because I think, I mean, I'm not a teacher like you, but I get so much back from sharing what small skills I have with other people, and seeing how they feed back to me, and you know, I think that's, you know, Jess, I think the most valuable project for me is definitely the weekends that we do.
Yeah, I think, can I just throw something in there as well, about things that we've been involved in a creative process since Lisha died. I think the one thing that means most to me is doing things that we know that Lisha would have done, or she would have been involved in. And one thing that she really enjoyed doing was being in the garden and planting plants, sowing seeds that would grow into peas and pea plants. So we actually, especially during lockdown, we spent hours and hours doing things, knowing that Lisha would have been there with us, and that's quite comforting to know that she would have enjoyed that as well.
You don't find that too bittersweet? That's business.
Yes, as well.
Of course it is.
Yes,
of course it is.
well.
Yeah. But it's better to do that and know that she would have been there than to not do it. I think for me anyway. It was a reassuring process. Yeah.
Another question coming up here, which is a really important one from Ronan. What can friends and family do to support and help bereaved parents? We feel that talking about grief brings sadness close to the surface, and naturally we don't want to make anyone feel worse. Well, I can answer that briefly and then hand it around. I think that the fear that people have about bringing our grief to the surface is really nothing that people need to worry about, because it's always near to the surface. And if you have the courage to mention our child's name, you might bring a tear to our eyes, but it'll actually be a tear of joy and appreciation. And even if you just say, I don't know what to say, that's okay. But I think when you represent such a fearful thing for people, it makes it very difficult. to talk about it.
But I also think that's a really good question. I think it's a really brave question as well, because it's something that from our side of the glass, so to speak, we think that we know, all right, that nothing is going to make anything worse for us by somebody talking about our child. It's just not going to happen. So there's nothing that that anybody else can say, all right, that's going to make things worse.
Well, it can't be fixed anyway.
In effect, if you talk openly about, however it is that you're feeling about somebody else's bereavement, however it is that you're feeling, if you're open and honest about it, that's not going to make them feel worse.
No.
It's just not going to happen. It's just going to make them feel better because there's that empathy coming through.
Yeah.
It's about giving people
And I think
agency.
we have found that with people who a couple of work colleagues maybe, or a couple of friends who are comfortable talking to us about Lisha and about how we feel about her death. We're very happy to be embraced by their empathy, because that's what they're doing. They're showing us empathy by talking. And I think don't be afraid to ask us how we're feeling, and we'll always tell you. I'm sure we'll always tell you how we're feeling, and just we'll be very happy to talk about our children, because we don't get a chance to talk about them as much as if they were alive and with us, because they're not present with us every day. They're in our hearts every day, but we don't get the chance to talk about them. So I love every opportunity to talk about Lisha, and we'll be very happy to answer any questions that people have about her.
I think there's a very deep need in families to remember, to share memories. It's part of the storytelling of someone's life, isn't it? It's buying into the story, and the more opportunities you have to do that, especially with other people, it's reassuring that other people remember. And every time someone lights a candle on Lisha's giving website, or whenever anyone sends a card on her anniversary or something like that, it's so reassuring to know that other people are part of that story. And remember Lisha's story. I think it's the most important thing.
What's the best things we can do to support those who are grieving? That comes from a father of 2 daughters. Anybody want to pick that one up?
Probably along the lines. This is Dave. Hi, Dave. It's probably along the lines of what for me personally, what we've just been talking about. It's about engaging with parents about their children. I acknowledge it's a very, very difficult thing to do, especially when the environment might make it tricky. But it is about acknowledging the person who's died, Lisha in this case, or Josh for you, and talking about them and remembering them, and as I know is important for some people who are listening to us right now, sending best wishes and mentioning their name. I think that's exactly what I would recommend to anybody who's friends with a bereaved parent.
I was thinking as well about the time frame of grief, because of course once the funeral's over, everyone's life goes back to normal, and I think that's right, that as you say, Liam, it's in the years ahead that it's more touching than ever if somebody remembers, because we always remember. I mean, it's 10 years since January, but you'll always remember. It's so lovely if people say a few years later, how are you doing? Or I was just thinking about, or I had a memory. There's a great question there. Can you share a memory of Lisha and Josh that makes you smile?
Memory of Lisha that makes you smile.
Oh, there's loads of memories. I have to pick one.
Just one.
We'd be driving to hospital from our house, and it would take nearly an hour to drive to hospital, and she'd always put on music and turn it up loud. And on one occasion she was singing into a hairbrush and pretending it was her microphone, and that was unlike her at home to put on a show. But going to hospital, that was one thing that she did on a couple of occasions, not all the time, but that sticks out for me because it was very unlike her to do that. But she loved her music, just like her dad, and that's a really nice memory for me.
That's a lovely memory.
I got to. Sorry, Jane. I got to throw something in there, which is a story. It's a very short story that lots of people who are listening in already know, but it will bring a smile to their face as well. So Lisha spent a lot of time in hospital, in and out of hospital, sometimes for weeks or months on end. And there was one time when we were at home and she was well, and these periods were quite common. And she'd gone to bed. And then we heard this whimpering. We were downstairs, and we heard this whimpering and the crying. So we came upstairs, wondering what on earth was wrong. You know, there's always something going on. And she was not very happy at all. We put the light on, and she was her immune system was low because of the chemotherapy, and she had red spots all over her body, all over her torso, and she was so unhappy with herself, and she was clearly very poorly. It turns out, after a bit of investigation, that she'd used a felt tip pen to put blotches on her, apparently because she was missing hospital. She
wanted to go into hospital.
You know, but she was, as everybody will know who knew Lisha, she was very cheeky, and if she wanted something, then she would go to great lengths to get her way. But unfortunately, we found her out on that occasion.
That's beautiful. We've got time for one more question before we round up, and it's a very timely question because we're heading for Christmas, and this question says, what could others do at especially Christmas time to make life feel more livable for bereaved parents? Well, I guess just a little card saying thinking of you and remembering Josh, that makes me very happy.
Yep.
Or
That's
if
it for
you're with
me.
people,
Don't
raising a
leave their
glass.
names off the Christmas
Well,
cards.
that's what makes you unhappy.
So yes. So in other words, we're not a family of four. We're a family of five.
Always.
You're a family of four, not a family of three.
What would make
So
you
that-
happy at Christmas? What would help?
I think the same thing. I love seeing Lisha's name on a card, though I must admit that I've heard a couple of bereaved mums saying it makes them sad to see their child's name on their card. So maybe check with the family first, I guess. But yeah, just doing the same things that Lisha did makes me happy.
There's still questions coming in, and they're amazing questions, and I hate not to answer them. We want to answer all your questions, but I just want to answer this one. Because my son is devastated about losing his little brother, I feel like my grief is selfish because I should be supporting him. Did you feel this with your other children? Well, yes. But actually, by allowing your children to see what you're really feeling, in a way you're modelling a kind of openness and a transparency. You're taking off the mask that we've all been trained with our stiff upper lips to wear. So I guess just by asking that question, you're doing the right thing. You're asking, you're thinking, and you're doing the best that you can, because frankly, when you've lost a child, good enough has to be good enough. There's no better than that. It's just good enough. We're going to have to round up.
I think you can still grieve and support. I think that if you see grief as being something that is insular and just to do with you as an individual self, rather than something that is far more collective. And somebody was talking about, how do the children manage it, or how do we manage children? The basics within our family, that's a whole grief.
Yeah.
That's a whole grief. We're all sharing in this
right.
pool of grief, if you like.
Yeah, that's right.
We could carry on with this Q&A for another half an hour, but actually we can't, because we're live streamed from this amazing venue, Sundial. Thanks to Kieran, who's the manager, and he has just made this so seamless. The generosity of people at Cirencester College and the Sundial has been remarkable. The courage of Liam and Deirdre to join with us at such an early stage in their grief. Jimmy for being Jimmy. And just for all your donations. I mean, all we want to do is to make it easier for other bereaved parents, and because we can, we do. So thank you to everyone, heartfelt, for joining us this evening. And if anyone's feeling low or down after this, we hope that you can find a little bit of hope. But do write to us, because we will respond. And remember, there's amazing groups out there, like the peer-to-peer support group, the Compassionate Friends, that has a helpline. And on our website, we've got links to lots of support groups. So please don't be alone, particularly right now in this time of COVID, because it's a pretty tricky time. And if you want to find out more about Children with Cancer UK and the Good Grief Project, that will all be accessible as
So
well.
thank you to everybody for coming along, and all the money raised from the tickets and any extra donations is going to both the Good Grief Project and Children with Cancer, doing research to make cancer treatment nicer, not as bad, for more effective for children. And there's a space to make donations on the details section of the YouTube channel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. And
Thank
for old
you.
friends at Josh's, you don't know how special it is to have you here. And all the people who haven't asked questions, we appreciate you being here too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.